Good afternoon and welcome to At Yale Live. I'm Eric Gershon. Today we go behind the scenes of the oldest university-based art museum in the United States, Yale University Art Gallery, founded in 1832. Our guide is gallery director Jock Reynolds, who's led the museum from 1998 onward, a period of transformative growth, both of the gallery's physical space and of the exceptional collection of art inside. As always, we'll take some of your questions. Please submit them to Twitter via @Yale or by email to socialmedia@yale.edu. Jock, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
It's been an amazing year for Yale University Art Gallery. You completed I believe it was a decade-long renovation and expansion.
Yeah.
You opened that a year ago tomorrow.
That's correct.
Tell us a little bit about how this enormous renovation and expansion changed the art viewing experience.
Yeah. Well, first of all, what's really important to know is the renovations and expansion of the art gallery took place within President Levin's entire redistricting of the arts area, the master plan for all of the arts at Yale. So we were just one element in what happened. But what the switching around of buildings and the construction of new buildings and renovations made possible was for the art gallery to basically re-inhabit and restore all three of the historic buildings on Chapel Street that it had inhabited with its collections and faculty from 1866, when the art gallery moved into the first School of Art building in America at Street Hall, to its 1928 old Yale Art Gallery designed by Egerton Swarthout, and its 1953 Louis Kahn building designed by the great architect Kahn, who also did the British Art Center 25 years later.
So you've connected three buildings that were near each other, but you couldn't otherwise access.
Yeah, they were directly adjacent to each other, so the architecture we did with Ennead Associates literally allowed us to move people directly from one building to the next, to the next. So it really feels to me like a great three-course meal of architecture, if you will. It's a much enlarged gallery, but when you walk into each building, each one is a great piece of architecture of its time, and the contents, what we put on display there, have been thoughtfully arranged to be visually consonant and poetic with those three structures, and we've added some really wonderful architecture to the top of the building that's contemporary and due to also the issues of needing to make these buildings readily accessible, full handicapped access to all three of them.
Mm-hmm.
Now what this is amazing about this is, you take a guess if you know those dates, how many years of deferred maintenance were fixed in this project. It totals to 280 years. None of those buildings had been renovated since they were first built. So this was a major campaign to bring the buildings back to the full stature and beauty of what they were originally. In a sense, they were the three great artworks architecturally that contained the gallery's collections over time and now display them in their fullest beauty once again.
They're very different buildings, architecturally speaking, and yet when you proceed from, say, the Kahn building into, is it Street Hall? Is that the next one over?
Well, no, we call it the old Yale Art Gallery. The Swarthout building was the name of the architects, yeah.
It isn't jarring at all when you go from this sort of modernist Kahn building into the much older building.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing, if you go to something like the Met or the Louvre, some of these great buildings which have a more singular sense of architecture, you tend to get a little bit exhausted by it after a while, which is the distinct differences between these three buildings in a funny way refresh you when you go from one to the other. And of course, all of our curators and people we worked with together have thought about which collections are most appropriate to put in the Kahn building or the Swarthout building or Street Hall. And I think it's not just the renovation of the buildings, but the installations my colleagues have created that have also made it the beautiful experience it is.
One of the interesting things about the renovation is that you seem to have created a lot of new views and vistas from both inside the museum and on top of it of Yale and of downtown New Haven.
Yes.
And I'd be curious to hear a little bit about the thinking behind that. It was obviously deliberate.
Yeah, that was very purposeful. Actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's the other thing. If you're in a museum, you sometimes really want and need different kinds of releases and reliefs from the intense experience of looking at art. And what could be more beautiful than to look out across this great campus and city from various perspectives, in a sense to refresh your eye and relieve your visual palette for a moment. And also, frankly, to look at the other architecture that exists on this beautiful campus and city. And so we made a lot of decisions, and having the time to do it with a process that was really a two-stage process. There were 2 points in which we did the actual renovation over 2-3-year periods. We got to think a lot about which windows do you want to keep open, which ones might you want to close for an exhibition wall. So a lot of thinking and reflection went into that. And I have to say the architects were great to work with, but our staff was really wonderful in helping us arrive at the aesthetic decisions to have certain views and in some cases close off others.
Now, it seems to me that most art museums and most first-rate art museums are freestanding in a way, but Yale Art Gallery is nestled within a major university. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how that makes the gallery, how it sort of distinguishes the gallery from other great museums.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's a lot of people don't normally think about is Yale's actually the only Ivy League school that has a professional school of visual art, a school of music, a school of drama, and architecture. Others have architecture, but it's the one Ivy League institution in which, from the very beginning, when John Trumbull came as an artist to build and design and install his own work in the art gallery in 1832, a living artist was accepted as a central member of the college and later university community. So Yale is a place where, in my training as an artist, where you feel completely comfortable as a true member of the academic community here. And our professional schools not only train some of the great artists in the world, but we also teach our undergraduate courses from the faculties of those professional schools. And it was only really later, in 1940, believe it or not, that Yale added the full discipline of art history and an art history department. So Yale has been uniquely artist-centric. It had the first school of art and also the first school of drama in America. So that there's been it's in the water and in the DNA of this place very deeply at this point.
It also serves an important role, cultural role, in the city of New Haven.
Yeah.
I was in there earlier today, and there were school children traipsing around everywhere and really being engaged by, I don't know if they were docents from the gallery itself or their teachers from their schools.
Well, one of the things we've really done in the last 15 years, and we started it in a big way in the year 2000, is we really redefined our mission to be not only a museum with a great collection, but to put our collecting, part of the mission in equal balance with our educational mission. We are first and foremost a teaching museum with a great collection. And what we've done in the intervening years is to not only create many more facilities for sharing the collection. There are now 8 object classrooms and a whole learning center, and there's a whole teaching gallery in the museum. But even more importantly, we've given more undergraduate and graduate students central roles in guiding other students and colleagues in the public through the collections, and we now have an endowed graduate student teacher program that teaches directly from the collection. Now, these people are guided and trained by some of our great art historians and curators and volunteers on our board, but more and more we entrust students to take a strong role in what we do. There's currently a student-curated exhibition on the 4th floor of the Con building. We've done 6 of those in recent years. There are 3 more in production. So this is a place where students get not only exposure to great works of art, but they really learn, if they want to, they can engage themselves in any aspect of museum practice and learn a lot about it through doing while they're in our midst.
And yet the collection is, in fact, and has been growing enormously in the last 15 years or so.
Yeah.
If you would discuss a little bit the priorities that have driven acquisitions at the gallery.
Well, one of the things that's been most interesting in the era when President Levin was president, it's clear to everyone that the Yale became a much more global university. We now have students from all over the world studying here. And one of the exciting things that happened is we actually added 4 more departments to the art gallery during that time, and 2 of them were especially important. And we added a whole new department of African art, which covers a whole continent that was really only represented with a small group of works, but not a department. And we've added a major department of Indo-Pacific art, which is, again, takes on all the sea cultures and of the South Pacific all the way down from, basically the Formosa used to be off China all the way down to India. And we've added a whole department of coins and metals, and we've broken our department of early European art and modern art into 2 major departments because the collections are so strong. So if you walk into the art gallery now as a student from almost anywhere in the world, to some degree you can see your own identity or your own culture in some way and feel that there's something that in a sense of you or your heritage there to be seen. And I think that's an important thing, as well as that you can learn from the cultures and expressions of other people across time. And that's been very exciting to be able to provide that, and to also, along with that, provide the endowed positions and the funding that have made those new departments and the naming of galleries possible. So that coincided also with what I call the Great Levin period of sort of Yale's globalization.
The collection is enormous at this point. It's something like 200,000 total objects, many fewer on display, of course, but can you name maybe one or two of the many acquisitions in the last 15 years or so that you're especially proud of?
Well, what's interesting is you could name a single work or two, but in fact, what's been amazing is in the case of some of the things I was just talking about, Charles Benenson gave his entire African art collection to Yale, almost 600 works and 192 major works of modern and contemporary art. Richard Brown Baker gave his entire collection. I mean, it's not as though I couldn't also name some individual works.
It's not piecemeal growth.
Yeah, it's just, in some cases, people have brought us whole major bodies of artwork that we didn't have before. So that's been almost stupefying, the generosity of what some donors have added to the collection. And some of these collections have come from people who are not Yale alumni, but are interested in a teaching museum that also serves the community of New Haven. I wanted to jump back a bit to your question when you were asking about you see school children, you see a lot of people from the city in the gallery now. That you're absolutely right to perceive that. When Street Hall was given to Yale College and was constructed, believe it or not, during the American Civil War between 1864 and 66, it was given by the Streets, a couple from New Haven who had seen the great École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and they came back and said, New Haven needs something like this, and Yale does, and they gave it to Yale with the proviso that its front door open onto Chapel Street and be available to the city, and the other side door open to the old Yale campus. So a lot of people don't know this, but the first women to get degrees at Yale were happening back in the latter part of the 19th century, almost 100 years before Yale College went co-ed, and educational programs for people from the city of New Haven to come in and study, and visitors from the city to be involved with the gallery just happened very, very early on.
And there's no admission.
No, the gallery is free, and Paul Mellons, who was a member of the gallery's board when he gave the British Art Center across the street, entirely paid for that. And the last major gift of Mr. Mellons' life, which was $95 million, came with a stipulation that Yale never charge admission to the British Art Center. So between these two teaching museums, you frankly have two of the greatest collections in the world of their kind, and no one has to pay a single dollar to walk in the front door, which means that you can often just come in and maybe look at your favorite painting for 5 or 10 minutes and not feel that you have to try to get your $25 ticket worth. And it allows, frankly, individuals and families from all walks of life to come and feel that it's their institution. And we make a real point of wanting people to know, although Yale is clearly perceived as an elite Ivy League institution, that this is an institution at which we welcome all the public and anyone who wants to come our way. And you can't say that enough.
So with a large collection, with 200,000 items, you can only have, I imagine, a few thousand on display at any given time.
Yeah.
How do you and your curators go about deciding when it's time to add something new from the existing collection and put it on public display?
Yeah.
And sort of what are the questions you ask yourself?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, because one of the first conversations I had with President Levin when he hired me, he said, Jock, don't just ask me for a bunch more gallery space. He said, do something to make these collections more readily accessible and usable. He said, I know how large they are, I know they're going to grow, but we've got to find a way to share this work more fully. And he was absolutely right. So that's been done in a number of ways. First of all, to even know what you want to show and to let people know what's there, we had to photograph and document the collection. Libraries were way ahead of museums in putting their collections online, but the art gallery 15 years ago had about 1,500 of its artworks photographed. We now have 135,000 of the 200,000 done, and a lot of the ones still to do are decorative art objects or coins and medals. So you can go on the internet, or a Yale student or a kid in high school here can go on and see an awful lot of what we have online and know what, or a teacher can decide what they might want to see. And then the other key thing was to create these object classrooms in places that if something wasn't physically on view in the gallery, you could ask for it and bring it into an object classroom for a class session, or professors could ask some things that weren't in the collection galleries to go to the new teaching gallery atop the Swarthout building. But then the other key thing that people often don't think about is you've got to have staff to do this. So we had to jump tremendously the number of registrars, art handlers, people to get the stuff out and to carefully handle it and bring it into the galleries, whether you're going to install it in the galleries or whether you're going to bring it to a classroom. Our personnel growth went from 68 full-time people to 147 now in the time I've been here. And a lot of that has to do with making the collections accessible by documenting them and then bringing people in direct contact with original works of art, which is our greatest desire. I mean, we're happy that someone in Moscow today can watch this program or go on the internet and see what we have, but we'd most be happy if someone could eventually get here to see the works if they can. But
let me follow up on digitization a little bit. It's something that's happening here. It's happening, I imagine, at most museums. How is it changing the way museums think about their mission?
Well, I think, when you have so many things that people give you that they've lived with and treasured, and you just say you own them and you don't make use of them, you're really not doing them any service for their generosity, and you're not honoring the art itself. I mean, it means nothing to say your stuff's in a collection unless at some point it becomes visible in some way. So, making it visible through digital means or in books, the traditional ways it's been done is important, but we really maintain that it's that direct contact with the original work of art that gives you that special feeling, and that's something that really happens when you're just right there in front of it. For example, if you look at most screens or most books and then go see a painting in a gallery, you're always usually struck by how the scale of it looks completely different. Often, the paintings are all sized similarly in a book, and you go to a gallery and you find one of them's, 14 inches by 16 inches, the other's 8 feet tall by, 4 feet wide. So, and then you don't see the texture of the painting in the book or the way the impasto of the painting's put on. So we really believe that the work of art carries its own complex information, and that's the other reason we want to make the original available as much as possible. But in order to make that possible, you want people to know what you have.
Even as you change what's actually on display at any given time within the physical museum, there must be certain pieces, because of the extraordinary wonder they inspire in people, because of their sheer celebrity, are always on display and almost never come down, except perhaps for restoration or something. Can you talk about some of those that are in your collection?
Well, you're absolutely right. Well, the great founding collection that John Trumbull, brought when he designed the Trumbull Gallery and installed his own personal collection, was basically his great portrait of Washington. It was the great Revolutionary War battles, and it was the defining two paintings that bracketed them that Thomas Jefferson urged him to paint, which was the signing of the Declaration of Independence and Washington giving up his commission. Jefferson said, great, do the battle history paintings the way they do in England and France, but what was unique about America is this is what we did it for. And Washington could have been King George IV. He decided to give up his commission. You have to paint those as the bracket to the wars. And what a wonderful, sort of decision and encouragement that was. Remember, Trumbull, his father, was the colonial governor of Connecticut, the first one to break with the British. And so, when he came back as a young man after the war, when people like Benjamin West and Gilbert Stuart and Copley were making a lot of money and late careers in London, he was the young person who came back and to some degree allows us to see what the founding of our country looked like, who those principal people were. And that was an amazing thing that had happened. And so the Yale Art Gallery opened in 1832. That's 40 years before the Met opened. And the Hartford Wadsworth Atheneum opened in 1842, the first major civic museum. So Connecticut occupies actually a very formative period in the advent of art in America. So the Trumbull paintings are always on view, the great Van Gogh Night Cafe, many of our great Homers and Aikens paintings, or our great Rothkos and Pollocks. You can tick through the gallery. There are certain things that have such dynamic presence. You look at them, and this is the power of a great work of art. Just says, don't you dare take me off the wall, or some work really fights to stay in place. But you were asking about making things accessible. What we do now is to rotate the collections much more vigorously. And so, at least 3 times a year, if often more in many departments.
These are the permanent collections.
The permanent collections are changing all the time. And because we have over 50,000 works on paper in that building that can be accessed in our study rooms, works on paper often can only be up for a few months and then they're taken off view. But we want people to know that, particularly in our prints, drawings, and photography collections, that there are things that you can see in the gallery sometimes briefly, but they're right upstairs and you can book them for an exhibition or private or individual research. So making the collection readily accessible happens in many ways.
Jock, I'm going to take a question from a viewer. Mike H. Writes by email to ask, which artist currently not represented in the museum do you think would complement or sort of flesh out the collection? Is there somebody you're really hungry for?
Well, it's interesting you say that. We just made an acquisition that's going to go on view in March by David Park. It's a painting called The Model, and we happen to own some great paintings by Richard Diebenkorn and Elmer Bischoff, who are 2 of the great San Francisco Bay Area artists where I grew up out in California. But their great teacher and mentor was David Park. And it just so happens that there was a wonderful woman here in Connecticut who at one point bought I think one of his truly greatest, if not his greatest painting. And it finally emerged from that estate, and we've purchased it. And starting toward the end of this coming March, you're going to see a great display of some of our American art from that wonderful period of the 50s and 60s in the Bay Area. So, all the time we're looking for sometimes key works that we can acquire, and some of these come up as opportunities out of nowhere, and some of them we research and keep hunting until we find something that we really feel fills a gap and adds strength, either strength on strength or fills the lacuna in the collection in a powerful way. That's one of the great things that all our curators do, and that's where knowledge matters.
I'm going to take another question, this one also by email from Duncan G., who asks, how are the collaborations with other colleges, such as Bowdoin and Williams, working out, and do you think you'll expand that to other museums? Yeah.
Oh, thank you for asking about that. One of the other ways we've decided to make the collections truly and more readily accessible, and actually to learn something from doing it ourselves, was about 6 years ago. We got a major grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and we invited 6 New England college museums that are outstanding but have much smaller collections than ours to come to us with their curators and faculty and say, what would you like to borrow? We were in the midst of renovations. We said, no holds barred. Just tell us, what would you like to borrow in order to teach a course or courses you couldn't otherwise teach if you borrowed things from us? And we did that with Bowdoin College, we did it with Dartmouth, we did it with Mount Holyoke, we did it with Williams College, we did it with Smith, and we did it with Oberlin. And what came out of that was so fascinating in terms of the installations and the shows our colleagues at other institutions did that were interesting to us and clearly memorable for them, and allowed them to teach more fully in ways they had not been able to do without such single source loans. But we learned something about our collections. Anytime someone shows your work in a different configuration, researches it, teaches with it differently, you learn more. That's been so successful that we've continued that program, and we recently received a multi-million-dollar endowment to support that perpetually. So you're going to see a lot more, and we've actually already done some other collaborations with American universities and colleges, but that's going to continue on as a constant of our museum going forward.
So digitization, to sort of link these two topics a little bit, doesn't seem in any way a disincentive for museums to actually share the physical works of art themselves.
Not at all. The beauty of digitization, and we have, this great powerful database, is that when you're thinking about an exhibition you want to do, you can just go onto the database and say, well, what do we own by Winslow Homer? And it'll throw up all these paintings and prints and drawings and watercolors, and you can say, well, if I want to select from this, you don't have to go physically immediately look at every drawer, every painting rack to see it, but you can, at least from these thumbnail reproductions, or blow them up full on your screen, you can sort of make preliminary checklists for what you put in an exhibition or a book or a course. That's very valuable. There's nothing, and what could be better? In a sense, it's a deep visual reference library in addition to the information that comes with the database. So that, knowing what you have in order to, it's like knowing all the ingredients you have available if you're a great cook. I mean, you don't want to just think you got 5 or 6 things to cook with. You want what's in the whole pantry.
But also people who are seeing these works of art through digital means initially aren't satisfied necessarily. That doesn't sate their desire to sort of interact with the art.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I noticed, just because I'm so visually attuned to
Yeah.
issues of color and scale and everything, is, everyone's device often has a different color balance. So sometimes what you think is even the color of an image, once you actually come to see it in the flesh, depending on how you viewed it wherever you are, is very different. And there, as I mentioned, there are all these other aspects of, three-dimensional work. You can't walk around it unless you get 3 or 4 views of it on a digital database. So there, depending on the artwork, it's always best if you can get the chance to look at the original, but having the basic reference, of the work itself is important, because without it, how do you think of what you're going to draw on and make accessible? And then you tend to, I think, rely too much on just the great chestnuts, and the collections become a little more static. And sometimes just even moving great works into different configurations and juxtapositions with each other changes your sense of how to experience them.
You have been running art galleries and museums for decades now. San Francisco, Washington, Massachusetts, here in New Haven. Have these skills required to run an art museum changed in any appreciable way in the time that you've been doing it? I guess what I'm trying to get at is the 21st century art museum leader significantly different in some essential way from somebody doing it in the 1950s?
Yeah, I think people expect much more of museums now than they did in their beginning. Museums, when they were founded, did have a smaller viewership, smaller sense of who was involved in working in them, who was funding them. But the scale of it has changed dramatically. I would say what still is essential is to be a good museum director. You really have to understand, know, and care about and be passionate about art. And in my case, there's certain areas in which I'm an expert, and other areas where my colleagues know so much more than I do, but they at least appreciate my eye and my visual judgment. Then, at least in my case, everything since, to learn about administration and finance and legal and construction and architecture. Some of that I learned as an artist, having to renovate buildings for my own lofts and studios as a young artist. Some of it I learned when I was helping other artists of my age create alternative art spaces, and it was sort of a seat of a pants education where we all had to do this to help each other support our work when we were rolling out of graduate schools in the late 60s and 70s and trying to figure out how to be artists in America, which isn't an easy thing to do. And then running these bigger institutions, the complexity of budgets and the cost of producing shows and the escalation of values of artwork and the huge amounts of insurance and courier flights and everything involved. Everything's gotten more complicated. And I'll give you a good example. This Francis Bacon painting that just triptych sold for $140-odd million a couple of weeks ago. What do you think it's going to do to some of these future big blockbuster shows when paintings get escalated into values of that scope, when the cost of then insuring those paintings and getting them to museums where they're going to charge these prices for tickets? How much higher can these ticket prices go? How much can people afford to do some of this? There are a lot of pressures in the art world now that are on a lot of museums. And I have to say, being in a university or college art museum where what we do is so integral to the educational mission, and where our collections are so strong, we can draw on our collections, which are just there for us, single source, in a way that very few institutions can. We're in a wonderful position to be self-reliant and to share, as I mentioned, our collections generously with others, and to do it without trying to monetize our collections. We are not trying to monetize our collections, and we've just gone to a free membership program as well. It's a little bit more like public radio, where you take advantage of a great resource, and that if you want to contribute back with gifts of your time or art or money, you can do so. And we're finding a wonderful response that's historically been there like that, but it seems to be increasing.
Let me ask you about another issue in art outside of Yale. The Detroit Institute of Art is in a tough spot right now because it's a publicly owned collection, and the city of Detroit is in bankruptcy. And there's been some talk about by the bankruptcy administrator of perhaps selling off some of that collection in order to help pay off the city's debts. What is your sense of how that's playing out and likely to play out?
Yeah, well, it's a very complicated situation. Graham Beale, the director, is a good friend of mine, and Richard Manoogian, who named our American Art Galleries, as the past chairman of the board of that institution. So you're right, it's a city-owned, and it's been heavily subsidized by the city, and it's had periods of time and economic turmoil while it's been able to be open or closed lesser days. This isn't the first time they've had some trouble. But when it comes to perhaps selling some works in the collection, I don't think it's that well understood that a fair number of the greatest works, probably quite a bit of the majority of them were given by private into people and not bought by public money. So the ultimate value of that collection is staggering if it were to go on the market, but the things bought with actual city-based funding is probably not as big as possible. And I found it incredibly heartening that the regional towns, the suburban towns, were willing to vote a tax on themselves to preserve and help fortify the budget of the Detroit Art Institute. So that support is quite unique in a time when most people are resisting taxes. And it's a beautiful museum. I mean, I just love going there. And it was the first major museum in America to buy a lot of the great art when the Fords and the great wealth of America was centered in Detroit and in the 20s in particular and early 30s. So I think, frankly, they're going to work that out in some way, whether it's some kind of private buyout of some of these things that contributes some money to the city to distribute. But because the tragedy of Detroit is that these people who work for the city and have these legitimate pension obligations that should come their way should not be left in their old age to not have what was rightfully theirs. And so I think there's still going to be some positive way that works out, because if you denigrate that collection in significant ways, it's going to be very hard to build confidence to enhance it again when the city gets back on its feet. And I think this is a problem in museums. If people start, whether it's for duress or whether you want to sell a great painting in order to just create a new acquisition fund, how are people going to feel when you take some of your greatest treasures and sell them when they thought they were going to reside there in perpetuity? I frankly would expect to be dumped out the front door if I proposed to sell some of our great paintings just to maximize new acquisition funds. In fact, I think you were asking about things directors need to do is, a big part of what I and others need to do is to find people who care enough about different aspects of the museum and are willing to fund it. And in our case, we've spent most of our time wanting to build our endowment so that whenever possible, with the great management of David Swenson at Yale, we've put money into endowment, because if you try to live only off your salary, you're not going to run an art museum. So, I learned that running these alternative art spaces where every year I had to turn right around and raise the whole budget again. So I'm a kind of an endowment freak.
Let me take another question from a viewer. This is from Omar. This is a sort of a Yale-centric question, actually. Can you talk a little bit about the conservation efforts going on at Yale's West Campus, which is a relatively new part of the university, and the interaction, to the extent there is one, with the gallery? Yeah.
Well, it's very exciting. Actually, in the next year or two, you're going to start to hear much more about Yale's West Campus. There's a very large building out there that was originally part of the Miles Laboratories before Bayer bought it out. It's over 425,000 square foot building. To put this a little bit in a visual perspective, it's being re-roofed right now, and the rooftop is 10 acres. So put that in your mind for scale. This building has now been given over to the major collecting institutions of Yale, the Peabody Museum, the British Art Center, Yale's musical instrument collection, and the Yale Art Gallery. And we're in the process. We've already established wonderful science conservation research labs there. We're building out a major conservation center there. We've established a new digital center there. And we just last week, the provost approved a major open study storage collection area that the gallery is going to be developing over the next 2 years. And so there's going to be much more on display. This gets, again, to the idea of having the collection readily accessible and treating it and having students and people engage it. That's all going to be happening out there in addition to what we do downtown. And again, we'll expand Yale's engagement with art in a very deep way and do something else that President Levin wanted, which was to have a situation where you would have expertise from the arts, humanities, and sciences doing research and work together on West Campus. So, I'm frankly wishing I were 10 or 15 years younger right now.
Let me ask you about yourself a little bit. You, as you've mentioned earlier in the show, you are an artist. Do you have? I can't imagine that you have a whole lot of time to make art these days, but maybe you do, and I have to believe you have some things in mind. What's going on for you in the art world?
Well, actually, it's interesting you asked that question, because my wife and I have collaborated as artists for since we met in the mid-'70s, and we've just been asked actually if we'd consider doing a commission for the centennial of the Panama Exposition at San Diego for the Contemporary Art Museum out there, who's run by someone who's been after us to do something for years, and we're trying to figure out whether there'd be any way we could produce a new work for this. You know, it takes a little bit of time off to do it. Yeah, I think that being able to still make art, you know, before I, go to the great beyond is still something I want to get back to. I've signed up for my 4th 5-year term here, and if you were to ask me, well, what would you speculate doing beyond 5 years? It might be to stay here in New Haven and just maybe teach a course a year and make art, and maybe be one of the artist residents out in West Campus and stay engaged, because I love being around the students and the faculty in this community, and we found it a wonderful place to live and be.
The renovation, the expansion was a massive project, costly, took many years. I imagine there must be some temptation to take a deep breath and just rest for a minute. But I know that you're ambitious and Yale is ambitious. Are there other big projects that you're eager for the gallery to take on? Of any kind?
Well, there are. The West Campus you just touched on. The other project I really hope to get done before I leave as director is to unify some of the staff offices that are in the immediate downtown. One thing I didn't mention is when we cleared out those 3 buildings that are now the Yale Art Gallery proper, we call it sort of the mothership on Chapel Street, we took an awful lot of our offices out of those buildings with the idea to maximize more of these object classrooms and galleries. So we're actually staffed in 4 different buildings in the immediate area downtown, and we've been offered a building by Yale to move into on Crown Street, but it's another one that it's about just under 20,000 square feet, but it's going to require about a $15 million renovation. So, there's more money to raise. My first obligation, frankly, as director right now, working with the university and staff, is to get us fully back to the kind of secure financial position we were in before the art galleries and Yale's endowment took a strong hit in the recession of 2008, because, so many people suffered a big, downturn in the value of their endowments or their contributions, whatever. We were frankly deeply fortunate that we haven't had to lay off a single person. We were able to raise the money from our donors to finish the renovation, even in the teeth of the recession. But Yale still has an overall small structural deficit we're all trying to eliminate and build our endowment back to the point that, my greatest hope is to leave my successor in a very strong and firm financial position, but still hungry to want to raise money for new projects.
We're going to wrap this up in just a minute, but I have to ask about a tombstone that I noticed when I went through the gallery most recently of John Trumbull.
Right.
Is it true that he at one time was buried beneath the gallery? Remind viewers who he is.
Well, Colonel John Trumbull, the founding artist who created the Yale Art Gallery back in 1832, was in fact actually buried along with his wife under the original the Trumbull Gallery on Old Yale campus. That building was torn down in 1901 at Yale's bicentennial, and his remains were placed under Street Hall, later transferred.
Which is now one of the gallery's buildings.
Yeah, but then they were later transferred underneath to the Swardow building for a while when art history took over Street Hall for a while. The original document said he needed to always be near his Washington paintings, underneath them, and Yale observed that very strictly. And so when we renovated Street Hall, which was the building with the first School of Art, we reburied, he and his wife are under there, right under his paintings, down under the bottom of Street Hall. And I always tell people we have the longest artist in residence in America.
Jock Reynolds, director of the Yale University Art Gallery, thank you for spending some time with us today. Thanks to all of you for watching, and please do join us again next time.
My pleasure. Thanks.